So trust comes at different speed with different members in your team, and it comes over time. And I'm really stating very obvious things, but I think that's again a point that you remember, because things do not come just like a spark and everything is fine.
As leaders, should we begin by trusting our followers, or should we withhold our trust until it has clearly been earned? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from veteran leader Frederic de Rougemont. For 19 years between 2002 and 2021, Frederic filled top positions in the building materials industry. This included CEO roles in France, South Korea, South Africa, and Singapore. Today, Frederic is a strategic advisor within his own firm, Rougemont Advisory, as well as a consultant with Telos Partners, a business consultancy with offices in the Americas, Asia, and Europe. By any standard, Frederic's resume is impressive. But what I most appreciate about him are things that don't show up on his resume. Despite his global leadership experience, his most defining quality is his consistent willingness to grow both as a person and as a leader. And I should know, because my first exposure to Frederic was having him as a client. Imagine a seasoned global CEO who is not only keen to share his experiences, but who is equally open to learning from others. Sounds like the type of leader most of us want to follow, doesn't it? So we begin today with Frederic's history, getting to hear about the leaders and situations that have helped shape him and his views on leadership.
Bernard, it's a great person. That's what he is. He's still alive. So that's a great person, meaning that even in tense business situations or things which were not progressing as expected, or I never saw him, dismissive or trying to make comments which would just be made to increase pressure on me and hoping that would lead to better results. Not at all. He was always, available, listening, very attentive, and having a behavior with me, basically, which was showing, look, in the time of our conversation, you are the point of my interest, and I'm going to focus on that. That was all about caring, listening, being curious, which doesn't mean, not challenging or not being demanding. Not at all. I mean, it was demonstrating to me that you can be demanding and nice at the same time, and demonstrating a lot of trust. That's really the person that keeps in my mind and became a kind of role model. His image came back to my brain all the time. So really became a reference. Bernard.
When you think about Bernard, one of the things that strikes me about what you've shared there is something that I hear over and over again from people, which is the best leaders that we interact with have an impact on us well outside of the time period specifically when we follow them. They echo, as the saying goes. And I think it's important for all of us to keep that in mind, because if we think about our effectiveness as leaders just in the moment, then in all likelihood, we're probably not going to be performing at the highest level as a leader. In other words, if I think about how can I lead in this circumstance, this situation, whatever it might be, difficult or in times of plenty, what would it look like to have a longer view? What would it mean to say, as I look at the people I'm leading, how can I do this so well so that 20 years from now, when they're off working on somewhere else, they're leading their own companies, that they would be able to look back and say, this is the person that I want to emulate. That's an incredibly high standard.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you do something, it's really hard to do something and at the same time question yourself about what you do. Will what you do have an impact on the person you are dealing with like 20 years later? At the same time, you're right. When your book, The Leaders Worth Following, the only leaders worth following. I mean, that should be the goal of any leader, to say, okay, if I'm becoming a real good person in the sense of what you describe in your book, that must be that you must have an impact, which is not only on the spot, but must be lasting over time. And you would hope that people that you have led years later will say, yeah, I mean, when I worked with Frederic, for that instance, I mean, I had a good time, and I can explain that as I can explain today about burnout, basically.
Well, and I like what you say about challenge as well. This is also a theme. When people talk about the best leaders they've ever followed, I could not count the number of times that they talk about being challenged, being pulled to a higher standard than they were before, being shown that, hey, you can do more. And so it's not all this, well, they just gave me hugs and told me how great I was.
No, absolutely, and that's. I think that's why some people are skeptical when they hear about all that. They say, "Come on!" I mean, especially in a business setting, a lot of people have this idea that to be a successful leader, you need to be hard, you need to be tough, you need to be demanding, and that cannot fit with being, caring and agapon and not even talking about being trusting people that you are leading. People are confusing things. I mean, the two things are not contradictory at all. And I would even say, I mean, people try to manage by fear, pressure only, and they may be successful in short term, but they cannot be successful in long term. I think that you can reach short term success, but you cannot reach long term success with that.
Yeah, I'm glad you make that distinction because I think there's a lot of things that can work in the short term that are actually detrimental in the long term, and those are two different games. What are some other circumstances or people that have landed with you in a unique way, influencing the way that you lead?
Well, I think that that's a job that I had for many years as being the CEO of Yuji Ball, this passport business in Asia. And I think the short story is that, I came to that job. I had the vis-a-vis my board. My board was of course fully aligned with me in terms of strategy and priorities and all that. But I had a great autonomy on what I wanted to do with my team, the way I would organize it, the choice of people that I would make, and all these things. And, I was really at some point, after a few months in the job, I said, okay, well, Frederic, you have a lot of convictions about leadership. You have great examples. Okay, let's walk the talk now. And guess what? It's a journey. I guess if you ask my team, those who remember and how I was at the beginning of the journey and 10, 12 years later, because the journey lasted that long, and I was very lucky about that. I had plenty of time to learn. You use the word team, which is become. I really, really understand what it means. This work on yourself to become a better who, to deliver a better what, basically. You are not a good who from the start. I mean, you need to work. What I learned is the fact that you continue learning all the time. And if you do mistakes, well, you have to recognize that and you have to try to do better the next time. I think that's the main thing which sticks in my memory just now. This maybe that goes with humility.
What an important idea, especially for some of our listeners that are perhaps a bit more senior in their experience and where they are in their careers. Just a reminder that it really is a journey. The growth and development process never ends. I think it's important for all of us to anticipate that that's going to happen. And when you find shortcomings in yourself, or when I find shortcomings in myself, and I see in the mirror a less developed person than I want to be there, how about let's not be shocked? How about okay, if I say that I'm not perfect, then probably some imperfections going to show up. What if we just said, okay, this is what it looks like. So now let's get to work on that, as opposed to if it's so easy for us to say I'm not perfect, and then we don't think the next step of, well, what does that mean? What is that going to look like? How's that going to show up? We're like, oh, this is how it shows up. And being open to that from the very beginning and never ending is what I'm hearing you say.
The other point is that I could test with this kind of learning curve that blame and fear are very bad recipes. And I can just use a very simple example, which is very easy to understand, and that's something that we were really worked on with the team. You have this famous notion of carrot and stick, and said, well, you need to manage the stick and the carrot at the same time. And the more we progressed on that, the less stick we were. Well, we were neither using stick or carrot, basically. People are not stupid. And what we learned is that blaming and not trusting is the worst thing that you can do. Because when it comes to safety, especially when you are sitting on top of the organization, you cannot understand all the nitty-gritty of what happens on the shop floor. And the people who are going to find solutions are the people on the shop floor. So you want them to speak up. If they are scared, if they feel that if they say something, they will be blamed, they will not report incidents. They will not suggest things that can be improved. And that goes the wrong way. But that's probably an area where applying all these good principles of being curious, being empathic, being humble, being attentive, all of that is critical to have a successful safety journey. And we had actually a very successful safety improvement over these years.
So one of the things that I think, as we now begin to get into the meat here a little bit, I know you've got some passion about this idea of trusting followers. We've been talking specifically about the example in safety, but there's the broader principle here that you've brought up that got us into this, which is this idea of trusting the people that we're leading, and how you and I have heard probably more times than we could count leaders who talk about putting trust in the people that they are leading, but then not living in that same way. So let's unpack this a little bit. Talk about the challenges and the need from your perspective to actually really in real life trust the people that we're leading.
Yeah. So as you say, it's very easy to talk about it, and including in a chat like this, because you cannot tell somebody from now on you are going to trust me. it's really complicated to speak about trust. I mean, because in fact, probably you don't speak about trust, but you behave in a way which progressively make people trusting you. And that, again, that's another journey. I think when we all have this experience, you see, you enter into a new organization or a new boss is appointed, you may have a short or longer honeymoon period where everything looks nice. And then pretty quickly, hard questions come in the room or on the table, and that's where things become real. So trust comes at different speed with different members in your team, and it comes over time. And I'm really stating very obvious things, but that I think that's again a point that you are to remember, because things do not come just like a spark and everything is fine.
So looking back on your career, especially as you sat at the top of large global entity, and you think about, you had a variety of people who would, for one reason or another, come in out of the executive suite, join the team, move on to other things. On a practical application standpoint, what did it look like for you to extend trust first, where you could maybe look at some of your CEO peers and say, here's somebody who is really extending trust, here's somebody who is not? Paint for us the practical difference between trusting others, especially from your spot where you've been a CEO in organizations.
A few things coming to mind, Tim, on that. I mean, one is the easiest things to do to inspire trust at the beginning is to practice intensively curiosity. And real curiosity is to really come in a discussion, like saying, I'm not going to speak first, and I'm going to listen, and I'm going to invite people to bring their things on the table. And you will have to find a way to show them that that you are really going to take that into account. that again, that sounds obvious. It's not that obvious because when you sit in the leader's chair, other people come to the room. A lot of them have this preconception that because you are the leader, you are supposed to speak much more and to bring solutions and say to the team what to do, basically. And there's a lot of false assumption in the room about the followers thinking that the leader is there to guide them, and the best way for them to be guided is to be instructed, basically. So you have to escape from this trap, because if you spend your time giving instruction and guiding them, the trust building will be very, very slow or will not exist. People will feel like they are trusted if they feel like they will be listened to, they will be able to contribute, and whatever they say is taken is taken seriously.
It's interesting, especially as we have people enter our organizations from other places. There's an opportunity there to learn from somebody else's perspective. They haven't always been here breathing the air in this organization. And so that curiosity that you're talking about, that openness to maybe they're going to bring something to us, not just their real-time contribution, but their past that comes in. Is there something from there that's going to make us better? If all I do is instruct, we're not going to get a chance to leverage what you're bringing in the door that could be new. And the other thing that pops to mind to me is it makes a lot of sense to say, well, when somebody asks me questions and I get to fully share my perspective, even if that person in their authority says we're going to go another direction, they're usually able to say, I understand your perspective now that I've heard it. Here's why we're going to go over here. As an adult, I can say, well, I may not agree with that, but I've been heard. And so there is a deeper trust in that moment, because they're not saying no to me blindly. They're saying, no, okay, I've heard your whole story. I've heard your whole logic. And while I appreciate you sharing it, here's why we're going to go another direction. I have more trust in that situation, even though we're not going my way. Have you seen things similar to that play out?
Yeah, sure. I've seen a lot of that. It's a very fine line, because you can have situation where I can say as a leader, yes, I've listened to you, but here are the reasons why we're going to do that differently. It all depends how you say that, because it can be, if you are not careful, it can be perceived like, okay, well, you said you listened to me, but in fact you did not, and you had your idea in your mind. It's more complicated than that. There are many factors which are building the trust, not only listening, but the whole behavior. Because otherwise people will say, okay, you are playing a game with me. You pretend you listen, but you don't listen.
I love you making that point, because, one of the challenges I think in leadership is that there are many people in leadership positions who spend more time and energy managing the perception of who they are than actually working on who they are. And there's a real temptation to say, well, I want my people to feel as if they've been listened to which I want to say, hey, I got another idea. What if you actually listen to them? What if instead of wanting them to feel listened to, which kind of suggests that maybe they're not actually being listened to, what if instead you actually listen to them? Now bear in mind, I'm not saying agree with them. I'm not saying that you have to agree with them. But what if we spent a little more energy on actually listening than saying, I want to give the impression that you're being listened to? I think it's very difficult for somebody to actually be listened to walk away and feel like they weren't. I think that almost never happens.
That leads to another very obvious observation, which is you have to do it all the time. You need to be persistent. I mean, if you are acting like, okay, right, I need to develop trust, so let me listen more to my people, and once in a while you try to spend time and do that. To be perceived as genuine, you have to pass, the first, at the beginning you will do it and people do not know if you are genuine. But if they see you doing it, systematically and really being careful about that, progressively the trust will grow. And I think one sign of that is that when your followers start to be able to to pop in your office and say, well, I would like to come back on the discussion we had because I had some further thoughts. In fact, you said this and that. I don't agree. Can we come back to that? And so that's really, when you start seeing that, I mean, something is happening in the right direction.
Well, that's a great note, because when somebody's going to say, "Hey, let's spend some more time," and I want to disagree with you, boss, probably a little internal celebration for the leader at that moment to say, "Oh, things are going in the right direction." You've reminded me in this conversation about trust that somebody that we both have had the opportunity to work with in Mike Kane. And one of the things he talks about with regard to trust is that the leader has to go first. He believes, this idea of the follower, no, hey, you can spend the next couple years earning my trust, or I'm going to lean towards trust at the beginning for it to be lost. So in other words, it's kind of given, I'm not saying 100%, but out of the gate for the most part, as a leader, I need to initiate by trusting first and moving forward. And Mike talks about the power dynamic that's at play with leaders and why it's so important that the leader, rather than kind of standing with their arms crossed at arm's length and kind of saying, well, prove it to me, instead, no, let's go first. What are your thoughts about that idea of the leader needing to initiate towards trust to begin with?
I completely agree. I mean, in simple terms, if you say, okay, I'm going to build trust, and I'm going to hide my game and not demonstrating any trust myself, then obviously things will not work properly. When Mike is saying the leader needs to go first in some, complicated situation or some, I don't know, things where there's a notion of courage there, and people see that the leader is able to take courageous actions and to protect the team, for example, that will be a factor which is going to increase the trust as well.
Say a little bit more, because that sounds like, ooh, that sounds interesting. But what does that really mean? What's something that's on the more kind of practical example side when you talk about a leader taking courageous action to protect the team?
Well, coming to my mind right away are, targets discussions or budget discussions in a business context. And people will see right away if the leader is able to walk the talk of the business and be able to stand in front of his boss or his board and say, I'm going to stand to keep, what I believe is best for the business and for the team, even if I'm receiving more pressure from the top to do something different.
I think of that kind of having been through and watched some of those budgeting conversations and knowing how boards in particular, and it could apply to an individual in a business as well, kind of ever pushing for more and more and better and more and lower cost and more profit and those things. And what does it mean then not to stand up and say, hey, we're going to have a substandard business, but to stand up as the leader of the business and you say, look, here are the realities. What you are asking for is outside of the realm of what's possible. And if you give us these targets, we won't be able to achieve them, and you're going to demoralize the team. What is it like to be in those conversations? Because that's, in that scenario, your job's on the line. You're pushing back against the people who determine whether or not you get a check at the end of the month. What does it take to have that kind of courage to say, I'm sorry, you're going too far, and I'm gonna lose the team if I come back to them with these things that are unrealistic?
That requires an ability to pivot the discussion to something else. And what I mean is that if you get stuck in a conversation, a pure target conversation, where the board is asking for more and the management is saying, no, we cannot do it, which is the classic conversation. If you are not able as a boss to educate the board, if I dare to say, about the broader picture and what you can do with this business, what check with the board that we agree on what to expect from the business, then you have more chance to get out of a dead end negotiation where basically the board is going to win It's not a courage like, I'm going to put myself in front of the gun and tell the board, please shoot. It's not that. It's trying to bring the conversation to a higher level.
You're reminding me as you share that, John Wooden here in the U.S., one of the greatest sports coaches ever, has set records that likely will never be duplicated in his time as the head coach at UCLA. And I saw him say in a video one time the importance of goals that are possible, which is fascinating because here is a leader who achieved things that many people would say were impossible. And yet, when he talks about setting targets for his players and for his team, yes, he's stretching them. Yes, he sees more in them than they see in themselves. But even for the great John Wooden, there was a line where he said, hey, if I put it out there too far for an individual, it's not going to be an effective goal to set because it's just more than they could contemplate doing. And I hear that in the story that you're sharing a little bit as well.
Back to the trust. I mean, you are saying something. It's like a chain. I mean, when you say, well, the CEO in front of his board can be fired, but that's a case all along the chain, and that's a big hurdle to pass. At every level of hierarchy. I mean, when in a business setting, that may be different in other organizations, but in a business setting, the leader has the power, to keep people or not to keep people. From the start, there's a kind of contradiction there to say, well, you asked me to speak up and raise my opinion and be able to tell you I disagree. That's all great, but how can I trust that if I go too far, you will not fire me? There's always that in the back of the mind of many people. That's probably why some people say, okay, well, in that case, the simplest method is fear, because that's black and white, and let's stick to that. But the problem is that when you do that, you cut yourself from having an absolute critical access to knowledge that you cannot have if your followers do not speak up.
What I love about what you're unpacking there is that we're acknowledging that fear at a certain level works. Fear can get a certain level of performance. The greatest levels of engaged performance, however, are not available to the leader who leads primarily with fear. And I think the thing that makes this cloudy and difficult is that the fear-based leader, in most cases, is going to get short-term wins faster. And so they're going to see upticks in certain things and potentially receive that in their career as feedback of, well, this is what works. When in fact, I think the analogy is it's kind of like a dead-end highway. You can go really fast and then you come to the end of it. And you can't push performance beyond a certain level with fear, whereas a non-fear-based, engaged, caring, empathic perspective might take longer on certain things, but has a longer trajectory, a higher trajectory in the long haul. So the way you're articulating, hey, fear does produce a certain type of behavior, but ultimately it cuts us off, as you say, from some of those higher levels of performance possibilities. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. I think I would add to that it would be totally naive to say I'm going to develop a leadership style which basically is 100% based on trust and care and all that, without understanding that in some places, at some point, there may be fear in the organization. You have to be mindful of that, which doesn't mean that fear is a good advisor. You cannot work on developing the trust of your followers and become a trustworthy leader if you ignore that, in fact, in the setting of a business organization, there is always a grain of fear, a little bit of fear, which will always be there, because at the end of the day, again, a board can fire a CEO, a CEO can fire one of his team members, a team member can fire anybody in his team, etc., etc.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit, because I know there's another topic we want to spend some time on, and it's this idea of being explicit with your team around leadership practices. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on that?
My simple conviction is that all what we have been, we've been talking for quite a while already about all these things, leadership, and you are saying yourself, Tim, that when you wrote your book, all what you have done is to make explicit things that a lot of people know. But like many obvious things, if you don't bring them on the table and speak explicitly about them, you are missing something. So that I'm starting from there. I think when you consider a business setting, a leader with his or her team, and thinking about meeting agendas and how the team works together, et cetera, naturally, people are all focused on the what. A normal agenda is to, review the performance of the business, define a strategy, review the business, review the budget, organizing training. I mean, you can fill up your days with things like that, and the classical leadership meeting would be around that. What I'm suggesting is that if you manage in the very same meeting to have maybe half an hour, at the beginning it will not be longer than 15 minutes or half an hour. And the more you go, the more people will be talking to you about that. But speak about, hey, team, how do we work together? What is the leadership style that we are happy to follow and develop? And doing that is actually bringing in the formal meeting room what people generally talk about around the coffee machine or in the corridor. When you listen to people outside the meeting room, nobody will speak about the what, they speak about the who all the time. This guy has done that, or this person has behaved this way. And that's, for me, that's obvious that it's in the mind of many people. So why not bringing it in the room? The beauty of that is that hopefully you will unlock basic difficulties which may be there, that nobody wants to talk about it, and which will make your conversation about the what much more fluid. I've tried to do that the best I could. Sometimes, people are not connecting to that, and you don't want to sweat it too much. But if, again, being persistent and bringing it back, helps people to really to reflect on that. And you end up sharing a common language. One beauty of who not what is that, when people start talking about curiosity or humility, you don't need to define that anymore. They know what they speak about, and don't tell me about agapon. That they end up knowing Greek at the end of the day. They speak about agapon, and everybody knows what it is. So the common language is very helpful as well.
One of the things that's so powerful about what you're saying is you think about what are the usual things that we talk about. Because the things that are on the agenda for every executive meeting, one could presume, are the things that are most critical to the business. And so what are the things that always make it on to the executive level meeting? Two that I know of for sure are the financials and safety. Financials and safety come into every executive meeting. It's standing agenda item that we are going to talk about these two things. Now, we may have other things on the agenda, but in every executive interaction, we're going to talk about safety and we're going to talk about the financials. What if alongside those was the standing conversation, as you're suggesting, about how are we working together? How are we leading? And if you want to go into the depths a little bit further and get into some of the common vernaculars you're talking about, to, as those meetings happen once a month or once every 6 weeks or every other month, however it works in your organization, what about the 15 to 30-minute conversation to say, how are we doing on humility? Where are some spots? And when the leader leads with that, all of a sudden now, if this is on the agenda every single time that we're going to talk about, in this case, we're talking about the who of leadership. If we're going to have that as a regular item, yeah, some conversations may flow better than others, to your point. But what does it communicate to the other leaders in the organization when this becomes a standing conversation alongside safety and financials? I think that is a wild idea to think about in terms of what are you communicating when you say we're going to talk about this at least a little bit every time.
That takes me to an even wilder idea, which is you say that 77% of the leaders' quality comes from being inwardly sound and others focused. So what about having meetings where 77% of the time is talking about how we lead together? And we in that case, you don't need only 23% of the time to talk about the what. Because if you really become really good at leading in such a way that the team works really well. The what discussion should become easier and easier, basically.
Well, the way that I would put that, Frederic, is we're going to make leadership a section of our executive meeting every time. Let's call it a half hour. Within that half an hour, over the course of the year, we're going to spend 3/4 of our conversations on who and 1/4 of our conversation on what. When we think about leadership development through dialogue, then, okay, we're going to split up the year. And yeah, sometimes we need to talk about the key components of execution, the key components, not just in our business, but globally in terms of principles. But as we're digging into to execution and strategy, that's 1/4 of our conversations over the course of time. 3/4 of them have to do with the interpersonal things of inwardly sound and others focused. And so it's still only a half an hour of each executive meeting, but within the context of that, I think you really could do a 3/4 who, 1/4 what ratio in order to match what the research says and do the best to move the organization along. And then what's really awesome when you do that is you get a chance to begin to tie the what of leadership to the who, to be able to key off some of your other dialogue around humility and self-awareness and all the other things that go into who. As you over time have a breadth of these conversations, then you also get a chance to show how these things connect to one another and why the who really affects the what. So I could see it, maybe not 3/4 of each executive meeting, but in the leadership development space, that 3/4 of that really could be dedicated to talking about the who. What are your thoughts?
To be tested. To be tested. It may make sense. Which is basically actually taking your book, having people reading that, and having people reflecting formally every time about what it means. At each meeting, I'm sure it will lead to a lot of very interesting conversations. But I bet you, I'm ready to take a bet, which is assume you have blocked half an hour to speak about, and in this half an hour, you have 77% of the time booked for talking about being inwardly sound and others focused, and 23% of the time on the what, and I'm not sure what the what will be, but people will have to speak about that. I bet you they will speak 100% of the time on being how to become more inwardly sound and others focused.
Well, let me ask you this as we begin to wrap up. You're in an interesting phase of your career. You've led all over the place. You've led large organizations. And as you look forward for yourself, talk to me a little bit about what you're hoping to do in this next chapter of your leadership. As you think back on all the lessons that you've learned, on the opportunities and experiences you've had, what is it that you're aimed at accomplishing as a leader in this next phase?
Right now, if I had to define my personal purpose in life, is to try to have a positive influence on the people that I can have an influence on, and that can be friends, family, and business people, of course. So with my current professional activity of being an advisor, I hope my success looks to me like having had an impact on leaders of other organizations that I can advise around the lines of all what we're talking about. I'm lucky to be involved in some startup business, but also in advising some well-established organization. And when advising this well-established organization, that's about talking with them about transformation and change. It's about explaining that, talking about that, see how people react about that, and that being who, not what, basically, and get them on board of these ideas and encourage them to practice that. So if I can have an impact on that, I will be delighted. And even in a startup setting, where at the very beginning, it's not that obvious to talk about leadership because there's no team most of the time. But you look at the interaction between the founder and the investors, very quickly the same questions come on the table. People have different opinions. They have a different position around the table. Some have maybe some more influence than others. And you have to be very careful that the basic principles of what we're talking about, like humility and empathy and having people who are inwardly sound is also very critical, even in such an environment.
I'm so thankful for Frederic having joined us on the podcast, getting a chance to hear his stories and experiences. And there are a couple of things I want to zoom in on as we wrap up today. There was a comment that he made really early on, which could have just been a throwaway comment, but it really caught my ear, and I want to draw your attention to it. As he was talking about leadership and being engaged with people, this was the quote. He said, "You are the point of my interest." He was talking about leaders showing up and what does it mean to be dialed in with someone as a leader? What does it mean to set all of the noise and all of the gadgets off to the side and say, I am fully with the person in front of me? Leaders have such a unique opportunity in this space of being present, paying attention, being attentive, because really, in many ways, the world gives leaders a pass. Oh, they're so busy, they have so much going on. And I think that pass gives those of us who are paying attention a real opportunity to stand out. Because in this noisy technology world, what stands out more than a human being giving someone else their full attention? And if you want to watch the value of that on steroids, then be a leader who is giving somebody else, somebody who reports to them, their full attention. It's such a unique opportunity. And I get that it was just a kind of a single comment that Frederic had in there, but such a valuable idea. I mean, what would it mean for somebody to say that as I interacted with somebody, I really felt in the most positive way possible that I was the point of their interest? And, we can take this out of the leadership space at work and take it to the space at home as well. What would it mean for my spouse at the end of the day to be able to say in the most positive way possible, I was the point of Tim's interest? Wouldn't it be great if my wife, Sarah, were able to say that? Or what about with my kids? What if they were able to say, when dad was present, he was fully here? And I'm here to tell you that my kids can't always say that. So I'm not claiming that. I'm putting it out there to challenge all of us, myself included. What happens in the places where we lead outside of work, at home with our families? What if people were able to say, she gave me her full attention. I was the point of her interest. He was the point of my interest. What if we brought that to the other places that we lead and influence, like at home? The other idea that I want to spend a little time on as we wrap up here is this idea that we talk so much about regarding trust. One of the things that Frederic said is blaming and not trusting, quite a combo there. Blaming and not trusting is the worst thing that you can do. And so we talked about this idea of leaders going first, being willing to begin with trust. And I just want to spend a little more time on this because I know there are folks leading who have examples to say, hey, here's a time as a leader when I extended trust and somebody let me down. It didn't work out well. I just want to speak to that for a minute because I know that it happens. We're not Pollyanna here. And in fact, you heard Frederic. He was very practical about the things that he was talking about. The point of trusting others is not that it will go perfectly every single time, but it is to say, isn't that a better way to begin the relationship? Isn't it a better way to extend that trust? Even if you've been burned in the past, let me ask you, let's say that you have been burned in the past, that you extended trust as a leader and the person didn't come through. Was that the end of your career? For most of us in most situations, the answer to that is no. I would say if I'm deathly afraid of somebody not coming through, one of the questions I would want to follow that up with is, what do you believe in your own capabilities as a leader? Do you believe that if something doesn't go well, that you can step in and help right the ship? Where's your confidence? Where's your sense of security? Am I so insecure as a leader that I can't share the responsibility with somebody else, even out of the gate? I think there are a lot of things for us to think about in this idea of leading with trust, starting by believing the best of what's possible and then going from there, rather than leading with suspicion. And you're going to have to come through perfectly 27 times before I'm willing to extend trust to you. I think it's a far more efficient in the long run activity to begin with trust. And yes, you can have check-ins and see how things are going, but we want to be careful that we don't sit on top of somebody's shoulder lest we say we trust them and then our actions communicate something very different than that. To wrap this up, I want to share a story about moving. Many years ago, I had a neighbor who asked us to help them move. They asked kind of the whole community around them, hey, can we pitch in? And so we all did. During the moving process, the matriarch of that family came to me on the side, and there's people milling about everywhere in the house, carrying all kinds of things everywhere. And she pulled me to the side and she said, I have a special job for you. And she took me to their family's heirloom dollhouse. And she said, I don't trust everybody to move this, but I trust you. And so there she was. She had said two things to me in that. She said, I believe that you're capable, and I'm putting it in your hands. Now, here's the question. How carefully do you think I moved that dollhouse? You are happy right to think that that is the most carefully I have ever moved a piece of furniture in my entire life, and that includes any furniture that I happen to own. I moved that dollhouse more carefully than anything I have moved in my entire life, and it landed in their new home perfectly as it was in their old home. Because she had told me those two so valuable things, that she believed that I was capable, and this is important. And that inspired me to be so careful because I wanted to come through. And what she also didn't do is stand right beside me the whole time and say, okay, now lift up that side. Now turn it this way. Now shimmy through the door. No, she didn't sit on my shoulder and tell me every breath to take. She trusted me. She communicated the importance of what I was doing. She communicated that I was capable, but then she didn't sit there. And imagine in a moving process, we've all been through the pain of moving at some point or another. Imagine if she had sat on everybody's shoulder with every breath, with every step, shimmy down the hallway this way, pick this up. You couldn't do that. Like, it would take forever to move if she was giving minuscule instructions to everybody along the way because she didn't trust them. And not only would it take forever, we would all hate being around her. It would actually damage the relationship. But no, with me, she had done just the opposite. She had communicated that I was capable. She communicated that it mattered. And she didn't sit there and try to manage my every move. And I was so inspired and motivated to do a great job. And so I want you to think about that story when you think about the idea of extending trust to the people that you're leading. So that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today, and that is this. Are you letting the people that you're leading know that you see them as capable, that what they are doing is important, and that you trust them to do it? I'm Tim Spiker, reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.